Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course, you can follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we sit down with a film professional to discuss their work, and this is made possible by our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. This week, I'm joined by Aaron Butler, whose work includes Jesus is King for Yeezy, I guess his name is now. I don't know what his name is. JT Leroy and Cries from Syria, among many, many other great projects. Welcome to the show, Aaron. So you've worked in documentaries, you've worked in television, you've worked in feature films, you've worked in reality shows, and a lot of filmmakers and a lot of editors would want to have this flexibility of going between the two different or the three different genres or styles of filmmaking. So how did you go about creating a career for this?
So I never actually planned on getting into a specific genre. When I was a senior in college, is when I first started thinking about, maybe I want to get into film or television. And but at the time, I was studying to be a lawyer, so I was doing pre-law as an undergrad. That's just kind of what I thought I was gonna do, was gonna be a lawyer. And making movies was just a hobby. It was just what I did for fun. It's what I did to entertain my friends. It was my just sort of side passion. And I did a lot of theater too. I loved acting, and I also loved directing theater. And so, my senior year in college comes along, and I was like, a friend of mine, Scott Bonds, who I always thank to this day, was, said, hey, why are you going to law school? Like, shouldn't you be going to film school? Like, you spend all your time making movies. And I was like, oh yeah, it never even occurred to me that I could do, movies as a career and actually make money at it. And so I thought, well, my senior year of undergrad, let me see if I can get an internship at maybe a film production company and try it out. So I contacted 20 different, companies and didn't hear back from a single one. I wasn't studying film, I was as an undergrad. And so, I didn't really have that experience. I only had my own personal experience of just making tons and tons of short films. And I kind of got lucky. I ended up calling this one production company, is the Saul Zaentz Film Center in Berkeley. And Saul Zaentz, he produced Amadeus, The English Patient, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he had this amazing film center there. And this was sort of my last call, and before I was going to give up. And it happened to be at a documentary production company. And the secretary just happened to be out that day, and one of the producers picked up the phone. And so and she had gone to Berkeley, and so we kind of had this little connection. And I was like, oh, can I come in for an informational interview? And eventually I ended up meeting the owner and the director of this documentary company, Bill Jersey. And he's been nominated for 2 Academy Awards and really is considered one of the sort of grandfathers of verite documentary filmmaking. I didn't know this at the time, but I really connected with him, and I showed him one of my short films, and he was like, oh, he's like, you're an artist. He's like, would you like to do a film with me? And I was like, absolutely. And so I kind of fell into it that way, into documentary. I didn't really have a plan, but then I really fell in love with documentary. And I found that I kind of have 2 sides to me. I have kind of like a writer side where I like to, think and create stories, from scratch. And then I also have the more sort of traditional editor side, the response side. It's like, oh, give me something to play with. Like I always like doing music videos, for instance. It's like where you get here's a song and you're going to create something around a song. And so it was sort of those sort of kind of 2 sides of me. And then I had the actor side of me too. And So documentary really kind of fired me up for the writer side. It's like, here's all this material, all these interviews, all this footage, and now go through it and really, in a lot of cases, find the story and create the story. You're creating this structure and you're finding who your characters are. And it definitely takes a kind of writer side. And I just loved that sort of challenge, that storytelling challenge. And I also loved the aspect of we were doing something good for the world. One of the first documentaries I worked on was this series about Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws in the South. And these were stories that were disappearing and we were capturing them. And it was so powerful. And I loved being part of something that I felt could make a difference and could change. And so even though I didn't mean to get into documentary, I really did fall in love with it. And then as my career progressed, there is the actor side of me. I think always was like, oh, it would be fun to do some scripted or some fiction, at some point. And I did short films along the way, directing, shooting, editing scripted short films. But then it wasn't until American Winter. It's a documentary I did for HBO. And that got nominated for an Emmy and an Eddie. And that kind of seemed to open a door for me, sort of career-wise. And that was when I got offered my first scripted feature, I Am Michael, with an amazing writer-director, Justin Kelly. And so that was kind of like, that there, I think you find in our careers that there are these sort of series of doors that are, potentially closed to you until a certain thing happens. Sometimes it's just meeting the right person. Sometimes it's doing the right project will open that sort of next door. And sometimes that door is just sort of moving up within a genre. And sometimes that door is actually a whole new genre. And so then once I did I Am Michael, it premiered at Sundance, and that's when I got a call from an agent for the first time, and that was sort of the beginning. Once I had an agent who specialized in scripted and especially in features, that sort of again opened up another door where I started getting more projects that way. So I bounced back and forth for about 5 or 6 years. I would do a documentary feature, and then I would do a scripted feature, and I kind of bounced back and forth for a bit. And then eventually I got an interview on, my agent got me an interview on Euphoria. And so, which is what I'm on right now, the second season. And this is my first scripted TV credit. And so again, it was kind of like a sort of series of steps, each way along. And part of how I got Euphoria was actually doing this IMAX film with Kanye, the Jesus is King film. That actually kind of opened the door to me meeting certain people, and then that led to getting the Euphoria interview. And so again, it's sort of it's always these like series. It's kind of a snowball. One project or one person leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next.
So you've worked with Kanye West on Jesus is King. You worked with James Franco on In Dubious Battle. You've worked with people with big personalities. And I'm wondering how you tackle working with them in an edit suite to ensure that the story is always the most important thing when you're cutting.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think, it's part of my personality. And part of what I think makes me a good storyteller is I'm very, very sensitive to people. I'm very, very sensitive to, how people are feeling and what people are thinking. And going beyond what they say to, what I think is really kind of going on with them. And I think that's why I'm attracted to storytelling, because I love sort of, engaging an audience. And I think a lot of that comes from being really, really sensitive to people and their reactions and how they think and how they feel. And so, yeah, when you're working with, a big celebrity, for instance, it's like you have to sort of even take it up a notch, and it's really, really, you have to be sort of even more sensitive, and it does take time, I find, because they're just people too, and they have the things that they love and the things that they're passionate about. And it's really about, as much as you can, getting to know them and being sensitive to the things they like and the things they don't like, because there will be ways of working that are very, very specific to them, and you have to learn those, and you have to really respect them. And it's like, so I mean, each person, and it's like this really with any director you work with. I think as an editor, we really are, we have these really close, especially in feature kind of situations, we have these really, really sort of deep, close relationships with directors. And it is a relationship, and you have to be really open and really sensitive. And yes, like you sort of mentioned, is, you want to protect the story and you want to tell the, best, most engaging story possible. But what I always say is, my first priority is to make them happy. They're the director. I'm not the director, so first priority is to make them happy. But right just below that, second priority is to make the most powerful and engaging story possible. And so it's a constant, sort of push and pull between those things. And it takes a lot of practice, and you have to be really open. And I think in a lot of cases, you just got to let go of the ego, and you may know what the best, thing to do is story-wise. But a lot of times, you can come around to things, it's like they want to do something and you're like, uh-oh, like that is not going to be good to the story. But hey, try it, you never know. Try it. And sometimes they may come back around and be like, hey, I think I liked it better before. And you're like, oh, good. And so yeah, it is a process, and it's a real skill to be able, to learn how to really work with people when it comes to the creative process, because it is art, and it can be very personal, and it can be very tricky to navigate that. So.
Now, Indubious Battle was written by John Steinbeck, and you said you're a writer as well. So because he's such a good writer, like when you read his stuff, it's really well written. So was there like, I guess, a nervousness about touching someone's writing that's so iconic in a sense, or like, how do you approach essentially editing John Steinbeck?
Right. Well, I mean, this is a very challenging thing always, to take one medium and turn it into another medium. And I think we see this all the time. Properties are adapted, from books, to TV series and movies, and it is difficult. It is very challenging. And it really, really is not easy. And, and also I think, it's just because of the experience of a book is so different than the experience of a movie. A book, you pick up, you read a certain amount, and then you put it back down. It doesn't have those kind of engagement requirements, that a movie or that a TV show have. And so that can be really, really tricky in terms of trying to preserve, something in the book that is really sort of maybe beautiful or poetic in the written word, but then how does that get translated? And and a lot of times it just doesn't translate. It's very difficult because, you know, novels can be so interior, and you're really, you know, hearing all of the sort of interior thoughts of the characters, and then when you come to a movie or TV show, it's like you are not in that interior. And obviously, you know, we're always looking for that subtext, you know, so that you want to be feeling that interior, but that's not easy to pull off for directors, actors, and writers who are doing these kinds of adaptations. So yeah, that's one of the most challenging things I think to do, is to try to, you know, and sometimes I think you have to try to do it stylistically too. It's like, oh, can I do something sort of more creative and more stylistic? And we, you know, and within A Dubious Battle, we went through a lot of different sort of creative variations where we were experimenting with ways of creating the feelings of the book in a non-literal way. You know, is there a way for us to visually or cinematically, you know, build this sequence that actually creates the feeling of the book, even not in a literal way, you know?
Well, and I think like, because you're talking about taking that feeling of the book and making a tone for the film or the show. So how do you work with tone, or how do you like to approach a scene to help enhance the tone when you're working on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first part is, you know, the first step is to really understand what is going on in a scene, in a particular scene. And you know, and really it's you have to really look at it in the sort of big picture, you know, like whether it's the arc of a feature or it's the arc of a series. You know, this scene is one moment, and everything that comes before and everything that comes after it all kind of interplays. So that's like the first step, is actually to sort of step back and be like, well, what is the purpose of this scene and this moment? Like, you know, and I always look for like, well, what is the sort of the turning point? You know, story is about change, and so we're looking for like, well, what is the moment in the scene where that change happens, and what is that change about? You know, what is the meaning of that change? What is the importance of that change? You know, where does that change come from the past, and how is that change going to reverberate out into the future in this storyline? And so like, you know, sort of spending time kind of thinking about these things and looking at the emotions, I think really helps in terms of, you know, of finding that tone. It's like, oh, like this tone, you know, for instance, on the surface, you know, the words that they're saying are very civil and, you know, very happy, like if you just read the words on the page. But the tone, you know, based on what happened, should actually be really tense or really or even dark, you know. And so you can start, you know, adjusting, you know, and a lot of this is about the subtext. It's about, you know, creating that duality of what's happening on the surface with what is really happening in this moment, in this story. And so then you can start to build things around it, you know, like, you know, somebody walking through a house that, you know, that could be meaningless, or somebody could be sneaking out of the house and trying not to wake somebody up who's going to kill them. You know, it's just, it's the same thing on the surface. But if somebody's sneaking out of the house, you need to start thinking about sound. You need to start thinking about, you know, every footstep has meaning, you know, the creaks in the floor, you know, you might bring up all those little things, the little sounds. You know, where you're going to put the camera, you know, you want to think about point of view. You know, it's like, oh, well, whose point of view is this? And it's like, oh, somebody, you know, sneaking through the house trying to get out, you're probably going to want to be more in their point of view. What are they seeing? What are they looking at? They're looking for solutions. They're looking for ways out. They're, you know, they're watching the person to see if they're going to wake up or not, you know. So, you know, once you figure out like what is really going on in the scene, then you can start to adjust the point of view, who, you know, where you're looking, where the audience is going to be looking. How much are you on a certain character? Are you hiding a certain thing? Or, because when you go on camera, and especially if you go on a close-up, it's going to really emphasize a specific line, and that may be part of that tone, building that tone with sound. And then of course, music too, whether you use music or not, and where the music comes in and where it goes out. I mean, all of these things can affect the tone. And so that's kind of just a brief way of like getting in the brain, getting in your brain when you're getting into a scene and figuring out like, what do I need? What is the scene really about? And how am I going to add all of the cinematic elements so that the audience really feels that what's really going on,
Now, you said you did your own writing. So what are the stories that attract you?
I'm actually a big fantasy. I do love fantasy, both kind of like science fiction and more sort of wizards and dragons and things. Always a big fan of that growing up. So I do tend to write those kinds of stories, but I'm also really interested in nonfiction. I'm really fascinated by the science of storytelling and the science of emotion. And I think that that can be really, really valuable, especially with emotion. I mean, if you talk about storytelling as a medium, like I think our medium is emotion. And yet it's kind of interesting to see how few people actually understand how and why emotion actually works the way it does. And so I find myself very attracted to that kind of writing too. So I'm always collecting, science articles and research articles and, about evolutionary psychology and, how did emotions develop and how they work and why. And so those are kind of my two. I sort of bounce back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. And, maybe someday I'll, if I have the time, someday I'll write a book.
It's interesting that you would say that because I'm very interested in the science behind storytelling. So if you can share any links with us, that'd be great. So like for the last few months, I've been really obsessed with the structure of storytelling and where you can break the structure or leave a structure and still hold the audience captive or still hold the audience interested in your story. So have you learned anything about that in your research on where you can divert from the traditional story structures and still keep the audience engaged?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those structures exist for a reason. Those structures are basically emotion machines. You can kind of run, you run a story through the structure, and it is a sort of tried and true way of creating emotion. But the problem is that they have become so overused. One of the most important aspects of emotion in storytelling is surprise. And if you're using these structures, a lot of times you can predict what's going to happen. And you can, oh, it's like, up here we go into act 2, here we go into act 3. It's like you already know the structure. And so it's not surprising anymore. And so I actually think it's much better to get to a kind of deeper level. I think a lot of these kind of books about story and screenwriting, they look at existing films and existing stories and they say, oh, here was something that worked well and was successful. What did they do? And they sort of look at all the patterns of all the successful stories and they're like, okay, here are the patterns, now follow those patterns. But again, like that's sort of you're up sort of at this surface level. And I think you actually have to get much deeper. Now, there's a reason why these patterns exist. And the reason is because of how emotion works. There are basically these principles of emotion that work at like a neurochemical level, and these evolved, over time, through evolution in order to encourage our survival. So these are all these, so basically survival chemicals that make us feel in order to make us act or not act, and this is really, like, I feel like the heart of storytelling. And I feel like most people don't really understand it. And what's interesting too about this sort of science of emotion is that in the last 20 years, the science of emotion has completely changed. And everything they thought they knew about how emotion worked turns out to be wrong. And so, and if you look at all of these storytelling books, and screenwriting books, most were of the classic ones were written before this. So I think there's some really, really interesting stuff about neuroscience and about how we are built. And so these principles of emotion, for instance, it's all about relativity. So it's like, if you have, if a character has a happy moment, it's like, oh, the audience will feel a little bit of happiness for that. But if the character has a bad moment, they have a failure first, and then they have that happy moment. That happy moment gives you a much bigger emotional response. And that's one of the sort of principles of emotion. And this works actually at a neurochemical level, and these are these kind of hardwired into us. And so, and I think, as storytellers, a lot of us just do this intuitively. We intuitively know these principles of emotion and we use them. But I think there is an advantage to actually understanding how they work. And I find that what tends to happen to me is that, when I'm in between projects, I'm just reading everything I can, about emotion, about creativity, about humanity, really learning what it is to be human. And I kind of, I get in a kind of sort of the intellectual side of storytelling, and I'm just kind of feed. And then when I get on a project, I let go of all of that. And then I just use the intuition that I've gained from learning all those things, to be in the moment, when I'm creating with a story. But it's really great though. And it's really helpful because a lot of times, you'll put together a scene, you'll be deep in dailies and you're just kind of lost in it. Then you'll step back and you'll watch the scene and you'll be like, like something isn't working here. And it's like, what's wrong? And it's like, and for me, I'll be like, okay, let's run through the principles of emotion, and it's like, so one of the principles of emotion is escalation. So like, if you have an emotion and it's like you have sadness and then you have the same emotion again, your neurochemicals don't fire as much. And then if you have the same emotion again, they won't fire at all. That repetition of emotion, it totally decreases. So if you have a level of emotion, if you want to feel more, you have to increase that level of emotion. So it needs to get even sadder, or you need to reverse it. You need to reverse the emotion and give a different emotion. You need to go into a positive, state. And then you can go back to negative and then you'll feel it again. And so this like sense of escalation, in a scene, like you can feel it sometimes. It's like, oh yeah, this scene goes up, but then it kind of comes down and then it kind of tries to come back up again. And it's like, oh, that's the problem, is that we're not getting back up. So it may be you may need to pull something out, or you may need to reorder something. And this happens even in scripted all the time, and it's like you reorder, and then so now you have that sense of progression. So it builds, and then pays off. And you have way more emotion, with that sense of escalation. And again, this is all working at a, kind of neurochemical level. And so, yeah, so I don't know. I'm very fascinated by this stuff. And I actually feel like it's very valuable, because I feel like this is the root of what is actually happening in all of these, story and screenwriting books. is how emotion works, how emotion develops. And a big part of it too is looking at yourself. We all have these emotional rules, that we learn throughout our lives. And so, once you understand how emotion works, you can start applying it to yourself. You can start seeing in your own life how your emotions work, when they fire, how they fire, and you can usually track back why. And so, sort of understanding your own emotional life in a really deep way, it's really great because then you can, again, apply it to your work. You can understand what it's like to go through this experience, and then you can put that into the story.
I have one last question for you, and we asked this of everyone we've been interviewing. We've been stuck in this pandemic for quite a while now, and a lot of, depending on where you are, you're locked inside, and then you're not, and you're locked inside. So a lot of people have turned to streaming. Is there a show or a movie you discovered that you think people should check out?
So probably the big one that I discovered during the lockdown was Schitt's Creek. And we were like looking for comedy, looking for something light, looking for something fun to kind of cheer us up during the lockdown. And I had never seen it before, and it was just great. And it was kind of fun because it felt like here's this family, who are they're trapped in this little town, and they're sort of forced, to learn how to live this kind of new way of life. And so it kind of felt a little bit like, well, we're trapped at home, and like, COVID has created this kind of new world, that we are living in. And so I don't know, that show, I felt like it came at just the right time, and I had a blast. It just made me laugh my head off, and it was just so much fun. And so that was kind of my guilty pleasure show of the lockdown.
It's a great show. If you're ever in Toronto, I know the editor, so I'll introduce you.
Oh, very cool, very cool. Well, next
and you
time,
can hear all the funny stories from behind.
Oh, awesome! Yeah. Well, next time I'm in Toronto, definitely.
So that's it for this week. I want to thank you again, Aaron, for joining us. Be sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com for all our latest courses. And of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. And of course, I want to thank our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking needs. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.